Well, as it says in the handout, I won't be speaking from this passage, although much of what I say can be found in this passage. One passage in the New Testament about materialism, I think 1 Timothy 6 is a great one. First of all, a little history about greed. What's the history of greed? A bit like the share market, greed has had its ups and downs. For many centuries, coming from the ancient cultures, greed was thought to be a terrible thing. It was denounced as a serious sin in the Bible, as I'm sure you know. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the 7 deadly sins. Gregory the Great listed them as pride, greed, and then 5 more. But after a while, greed actually took pride in place, excuse the pun, and became the top of the hit parade. But with the rise of free market capitalism, greed's reputation from the up. Economists said that greed, all that greed, but effectively consumption drove the engines of the economy, and the idea, remember Reagan saying that if the harbour lifts, all the boats will lift. So that we went from a limited goods notion of economics in the ancient world to, in the modern world, an unlimited goods notion. Greed's heyday, I guess, was in the 1980s, when Michael Douglas, playing Gordon Gekko, famously said, "Greed is good." The other 2 slogans on Wall Street, I'm told, were "lunch is for wimps" and "buy or die." So those were the kind of driving slogans in those days. But in 2008, people started having doubts about greed with the GFC. I'm sure you remember this. There were complicated explanations for the meltdown, none of which I really understood. One pundit put it in plain English: the root causes of the GFC were shonky lending and obscene greed. I had a little Google alert at that stage on my, this sounds kind of egotistical, but it's just a way of keeping track of your books. So I had a Google alert on greed and idolatry. So anyone who said anything in a sentence about greed and idolatry on the internet, I'd get an alert to tell me. And oftentimes they were discussing my book, which is always fun. But during those months after the GFC, I had alerts from the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Barack Obama, and John McCain. Now, none of them were reading my book, sadly, but many of them were going back to the Bible's denunciation of greed as idolatry. When McCain and Obama said that greed was idolatry during that campaign. And I think their sights were not just on the avarice of corporate executives and investment bankers. Apologies if any of them are here. The accusation was aimed at basically everyone who uses lending as a way of purchasing major items. So I think we have the GFC to thank for re-blackening greed, or at least making it grey again. And in fact, in recent years, a lot of social commentators in the Western world have questioned the rampant materialism. They argue that if we're trying to get rich in order to be happy, it's not working. And one social commentator said that Western happiness has actually declined in tandem with the rise of affluence. So they measure happiness and other things like that these days. Another one said that there's evidence that those who strive most for wealth tend to live with lower well-being. So with greed, you may end up getting less happiness rather than more. But I think I have to confess, it's a hard thing to do to talk about greed. For 2 reasons. The first is that nobody thinks you're talking to them. So it's what's a rich person? It's hard to define, isn't it? Most people think that a rich person is anyone with more money than me. Peter Costello tells a story about when he floated a new taxation change. David can probably tell me what it was later. He had a meeting with Kerry Packer. And Kerry Packer went across the table and said, "You've cost me $1 billion. Well, it's some large figure, that's what he said. And Peter Costello said, "Well, I think you'll be able to afford it." And Kerry Packer said, "Well, I'm not Bill Gates, you know." So it's certainly true. Most of us are better off than our parents. We've got more gadgets than previous generations. As Jenny was saying, by world standards, we're all rich. And yet, defining what it means to be rich is a tricky exercise, let alone what it means to be greedy. The second point is that when you talk about greed, according to some people, it's basically pointless because to want more is simply to be human. That's what it is to be human. It's to crave more and more. as one psychologist put it, deploring money and its effects is as useful as deploring the fact that we need air to breathe. The only way to give up being greedy is to die. Immanuel Kant said, insatiability belongs to the basic makeup of human beings. And I'll come back to that at the end. In other words, it is tricky to talk about greed. What I think can be helpful is to think what drives our greed, and that's what I'll be focusing on. Why do material ambitions still dominate so many of us? Clive Hamilton and Richard Dennis wrote a book called Affluenza some years ago. How many of you have read that book? Yeah, a few people. How many of you have read a book by me, just out of interest? Fewer, that's interesting. And they compared consumption and materialism to a disease. And basically, Dennis and Hamilton argue that the Western world's in the grip of a consumption binge, the greatest in human history. We're all addicted to excessive consumption. It's actually a diagnosis that Christians had in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they would compare greed to a disease, as this book does, and specifically the disease of dropsy. Now, any of you who watched Downton Abbey will know that there's an episode which includes a dropsy victim in one of the hospitals after the war. No one knows what we're talking about. It's a wrong room. Yes. Go Greg. Basically, dropsy is where you have this insatiable thirst, you keep drinking until you die. And so it's an apt analogy, and the Christians in the Middle Ages liked it. The problem is, though, I think, when you compare greed to an illness, you still need a cure. And I don't think Dennis and Hamilton really point to anything profound in terms of a cure. Intriguingly, other critics of greed have compared it to a religion. And this isn't just Christians. The obituary for Rene Rivkin, remember the high-profile stockbroker, in the Sydney Morning Herald said, his once loyal entourage of supporters worshipped their high priest at the altar of wealth. Amazing religious rhetoric, just in that description, not exactly a complimentary eulogy, but that's the Herald. Ross Gittins, writing in The Age not long ago, bemoaned the fact that we keep careful track of GDP, but there was a major work on how we spend not our money but our lives, on work, life and family, and that was cancelled. And Gittins put this down to our, quote, hyper-materialistic path, and talked of the worship of the great god GDP. So if you're slightly dyslexic and have a bit of a sight problem, you can almost see God in GDP. I think that's what he was playing off. Shania Twain, I don't listen to her, the student told me about this, has an album song where she says, we've created us a credit card mess, we spend the money we don't possess, our religion is to go and blow it all, so it's shopping every Sunday at the mall. So even if this is just rhetoric to get your attention, I think there's actually something to it. And as it turns out, the Bible has the same condemnation of greed. So Jesus, as you'll probably remember from the Sermon on the Mount, says that you can either serve God or mammon, mammon being possessions. And Paul, as I mentioned earlier, has two quite remarkable sayings where he says that greed is idolatry. It's in Colossians 3:5, just sitting there on a vice list. And the greedy person is an idolater, Ephesians 5:5. Then in a couple of places he accuses his enemies of having their belly as their God. Their God is their belly. I think probably in an extended sense of the belly is the seat of desire, rather than simply gluttony. And certainly the idea that greed is idolatry gets our attention. It is the worst sin in the Bible, and it's the one thing that arouses God's jealousy. It leads to judgments in the Old Testament, such as the exile of the nation Israel. In the Old Testament, it's not that the rich inevitably abandon God, but becoming wealthy certainly does raise the possibility. This is true in a number of texts right across Old and New Testaments. For example, in Deuteronomy 8, the nation is warned when they enter the promised land not to allow their prosperity to lead to them abandoning God. When you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord. So there's this idea that the rich don't need God because they've kind of made other arrangements. When riches come, there's a temptation to trust in yourself rather than God. I think the fact that greed is idolatry can actually help explain why it is that greed is such a powerful force in our lives. And it's for this reason. I think the impulses that drive greed are actually religious ones. So there's a sense in which we trust wealth rather than God, and we love wealth rather than God. This is true of society more broadly, but it's a temptation for all of us as well. So greed is idolatry in that the greedy puts something in the place of God. The first thing then, let me just in my time remaining cover the two things: the love of money, excessive love of money replacing God, and trust in money as a form of replacing God. There's of course a legitimate enjoyment of material things. The Bible's not recommending asceticism, a harsh treatment of the body, kind of monasticism. It's more a Greek idea in fact than a Jewish or Christian one. As it says in the text, you can read later in a little handout, God gives us all things, God richly provides us with everything to enjoy. So there is a legitimate enjoyment of material things, and there's an illegitimate attachment to material things. As the text says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Sometimes it's hard to spot the difference in your own life between an illegitimate attachment and a legitimate enjoyment. These are the kind of questions I ask myself to work out whether I am in danger of attaching myself too closely. Do I define myself by what I own? My dress, what I wear, my car, and so on. As Jesus put it, life is more than food and the body more than clothing. Do I share my possessions only reluctantly? Am I on occasion extravagant with myself, calculating and cautious in my giving? Do I find it hard to be content with what I have? Am I constantly yearning obsessively for more and more material things? Am I actually satisfied with the money and material things that I've accumulated? One thing's for sure, the love of money and possessions is, like all idols, a god that fails. There's a Sri Lankan evangelical, Roman Chandra, who wrote a book on idolatry, and that's the title, Gods That Fail. And the book's good, but the title's worth money, just on its own. And that's basically the Bible's critique of idolatry. It's two things: it's foolishness, and it doesn't work. It doesn't deliver on its promises. If its purpose is to bring pleasure, pleasure diminishes over time. Psychologists actually talk about this, called habituation. So back in Sydney, I convinced my work there, Moore College, to buy me a big Apple flat screen computer. In those days it was something special. And so I could do editing on the screen, see two documents at the same time. I could install in my study at home. Anyone who came to the door, Jehovah's Witnesses, anybody, I'd bring them in and show them my work. And I had this little button, you could watch movie trailers, fantastic. After a while, just my computer, I had to get up in the morning and use it, and quite recently I had the spinning wheel of death and needed more RAM. But that is. I think this is true of all of our possessions. The same goes for cars, sofas, beds, even houses. The buzz they give you is very much at the early stage, and after a while it tapers off. And in the end, you can only sit on one sofa at a time, in one car at a time, in one house. They just become your car, your sofa, your computer, your house. Why are we so prone to greed? One answer is that we're taken in by the lie that material things will bring us lasting satisfaction. When the truth is, only by knowing our Creator and living for His kingdom will we have that lasting satisfaction. The second reason is that we trust in money rather than in God. This is a great temptation for us. For many people, the meaning of money is security. You can actually buy securities and futures on the stock exchange, of course. Trust and confidence frequently describes people's attitudes to their idols in the Bible. And it's interesting, in Isaiah 44 it says, the idolaters say to their idols, "Deliver me, for you are my God." Not surprisingly, the Bible accuses the greedy of the same form of idolatry. Psalm 52 verse 7, the person who would make God his refuge instead trusts in the abundance of their riches. Proverbs 18 gives us this alternative. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. A rich person's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his imagination. Martin Luther described a God in his famous catechism, based on the Ten Commandments, as that in which I put my trust and ultimate confidence. Once again, the problem with putting your trust in wealth rather than God is that it will fail. In many cases it fails, at the very least. Whether it's moth or rust, which is what Jesus talked about, bad investment advice, undisciplined spending, natural disasters, economic crises, expensive children, or whatever, in most people's experience, money is not as reliable and firm as we think. Proverbs 11 puts it this way, whoever trusts in their riches will fall. Trust in wealth, I think in the final analysis, is another sad example of human folly. It's also an insult to the creator and sustainer of the universe and our creator, who alone constitutes that sure ground of confidence and trust that we're each seeking. But just to come back to where I was at the beginning, is there any point talking about greed, seeing to be human is to want more? What do we say to those people who believe the only way to give up being greedy is to die? I think in one sense they're right. The ultimate solution to the insatiable grasping of and obsessive hoarding of material things that marks our age is not just to say no to something, but to say yes to something better. It's not to quash desire, but to redirect desire. To be human is to desire something, but we need to move our desires to something else. Rather than wanting to be rich, we need to get really rich. Jesus concludes his exhortation on greed in the Sermon on the Mount with this very point. He kind of redirects desire. He says, don't run after material things, what you wear and what you eat, like pagans do who do not know God. And at the end of that little section he says, rather seek first God's kingdom and righteousness. So rather than seeking these things relentlessly, he recommends a relentless seeking of God and his kingdom. 1 Timothy 6, you'll see this very thought right at the end of the passage where it says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope or trust, if you like, in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves, see the redirection of desire as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Why are we so greedy? What can we do about it? I think the root causes of materialism are misdirected religious impulses. If that's true, then the ultimate solution is still faith in the true and living God, who alone gives us the security and satisfaction that each of us craves.